Hello and welcome. My name is Nicholas and this is Literally Graphic. And today I just want to touch on 3 books of a recent author read-through that I did, namely the non-fiction kind of autobiographical works of Marjane Satrapi, best known for Persepolis. But she's actually written 3 books about her life, and they progressively get more interesting and less popular, to be a complete snap. Let's start off with Persepolis 1, which is definitely the most widely read, is an amazing look at the life of one girl during the time of the Cultural Revolution in Iran. I know, I'll probably say this a million times every time I bring up this book, is that I read it back in college originally, and up until that point, I definitely cannot remember any other person trying to tell me that someone from the Middle East was a person. Like a pure person. Like, obviously not everyone told me that they were all horrible terrorists that were out to kill us, but there were some people who did that, of course. And there was also a lot of people who exotify people from the Middle East a lot. I mean, it's very easy to do when you are not from any of those countries. There's a reason that Orientalism is such a thing. Definitely a watershed moment for me, I suppose, where light comes on. They're people just like you and just like me, and that's why, despite being a complete snob, I'm really excited and happy, and it warms my soul to know that this book is so popular, because I feel like it is an inside look into a country that, by all accounts of American media anyway, is a really horrible place. And while her perspective really still pretty much agrees with that narrative, it's nice to get an inside perspective, someone who had to actually live through it, and it is more nuanced in the sense that it talks about all the people who are kind of living under this fascism but aren't part of it, whereas on the outside it can look like they're all just part of it. The artwork in Persepolis is thought of to be very much unique to Satrapi. This is mostly the case in my experience, but there are a few other notable exceptions, mostly A Game for Swallows, which some people thought was a complete ripoff of this, and which I would still argue is not. It is a very different style, and just because it's actually more white drawing on black background than either of the Persepolis books are, and therefore it and Persepolis to a certain amount do remind me also of a 3rd book called Epileptic by David something. It's a very dramatic, austere style, especially in this first book. It can be a bit simplistic, and I felt like some of the men with mustaches kind of started looking very similar in this first one. It was still mostly readily accessible and readable, and the book, some people complain about a few time jumps, but really the book tends to flow fairly well, and Satrapi's haircut does change from time to time, which helps let you know that time has passed a little bit. Since it has such a wide appeal and is an entry point for a lot of people, it could probably do with being a bit more simplistic, but this is a retrospect. Looking back is always like 20/20 vision. I did also feel like it reflected in a lot of ways the more simplistic view of a younger child, right? So there's a lot of reasons for everything, and you can explain it all the way. Another important fact that I've sort of been thinking a lot about in reading this book and reading a lot of other books and reading particularly negative reviews about a lot of the nonfiction books I read is the different ways in which people learn about history, and just the fact that they're both equal. Because you have, on the one side, you have the extreme where people are like, I just want a list of facts, and I want facts, and I want you to explore all the facts and put them in a nice orderly fashion, and Satrapi definitely did not explore these things enough, and there needed to be more facts and blah 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 blah, too personal, blah 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 blah. And then on the other hand, where I tend to be more, is like, yay, narrative, story, personal anecdotes and stuff. And a lot of people on the fact side like to say that wishy-washy people like me make no sense and that we're swallowing bias hook, line, and sinker. And most people obviously fall somewhere in the middle of that. But the argument I would make for learning history through narratives such as this that do include a lot of facts. Is no one I've ever heard of is endorsing that you only ever read Persepolis or Satrapi in general. There's definitely room and an assumption that you will read some other things that have to do with the subject and kind of fill out your view that way. I also think that there's an argument to be made for the fact that when you get to know someone in a personal memoir such as Persepolis, you definitely get to know their biases a lot better than if you're reading a factual book. And the thing is that people can come up with facts that back up almost anything. And when I'm reading factual books, I do find it a little harder to follow just because of my personal preferences and the way my personality, my mind work. I find narrative a lot more interesting. And I need something to be important in some narrative context. But that aside, since all facts have an inherent bias, and if the person isn't telling me about themselves and what direction they're coming from and is just trying to persuade me that they're being objective, like I sometimes do, it's much less conducive to discovering a more balanced perspective and much more like, this is the be-all, end-all of this. Do not question, do not look into it. You don't need to look into it further, and it's also hard to just try and figure out what their bias is, because inevitably there is going to be a bias of some kind. Personally, less than appealing, and my supposedly unbiased factual backup for that, I guess. But then moving on sort of to Persepolis 2 in this really super rambly, dragging on review of some kind or other. This book is definitely a lot less popular than the first book. And I have a very paranoid feminist reason that I think that is. And I think that is large part due to the fact that she hits puberty somewhere in the transition between these books. And people are more uncomfortable at least with women than they are with winsome little girls who talk to God and have overly fearsome political convictions. Where her first book is very endearing, we are suddenly faced with the awkwardness of a teenager who's living outside their home country, who goes through lots of angst and makes a shitload of mistakes. Obviously, the focus of this book is drastically different than the first, so there's definitely just some like expectation misalignment, as you might say, where people are expecting more of the first, and this one definitely goes in a slightly different direction with the much more personal experiences of Satrapi growing up in Austria, where her parents sent her for her own safety. But that said, I think there's still a whole lot that I got out of this book on a more personal level rather than political or historical. And that is, first off, I think an important point that I've really been delving into in reading all of Satrapi's work is what is the differences between violence depicted by people who have never experienced violence and violence depicted by people who have experienced violence, particularly in the way that Satrapi has. Like, I am someone who is not very keen on the depiction of violence, but violence is very intrinsic to her as a person just because of her childhood experiences. She grew up in a very violent time, and I can't just brush her off like I do so many other people safely over here in America who just seem to worship violence nonsensically. It also helps that she also talks about sex a lot, so, you know me. Kind of dovetailing with that, another really important thing that I've been having to grapple with is the experience of someone in safety when they really care about violence that is happening overseas. That was definitely not answered in this book at all, I don't think, but it is something that I think her narrative really contributed to my thinking about. Like, she obviously is in Austria and shit is going down in Iran and Iraq, and I'm safely over here in Canada, and at least my family is all relatively safe, but there are a lot of people out there, a lot of very innocent civilians who are dying needlessly. So how do I deal with that? And obviously a lot of my biases come into why I enjoyed this book as much as the first one, but I think there are some arguments to be made that it is equal, and that, again, it's just people's biases that are making them not appreciate this book as much. I mean, the narrative of female empowerment is not universally appealing. I think that you can definitely see Satrapi maturing in this book, not only as a subject as she gets older, but also as a creator. There's a lot more messiness in her social life. Satrapi makes a lot more of mistakes, and in the tradition of most good memoirs I've read, she owns up to them and she doesn't always show herself in the best light, which I always appreciate in an author, because I'm not sure if I could be quite that humble. So I admire it, and I also think it's, again, important to developing a more whole view of where this person is coming from, what their biases may be, and what they're really contributing to literature as a whole. Then we get to the final, third book, so far anyway, which isn't technically a sequel to anything, but it does definitely follow the arc of her growing up, so I thought I might as well include it. And it's called Embroideries, and this book is very, very different from the previous two. The art style is almost exclusively black on white, like traditional, you know, most of the time black and white comics, but it still keeps definitely her style, but even more expressive. I felt like I really learned a lot about each character in this book through just looking at their faces, and there weren't any silly mustachioed guys anyway, so it was very easy to distinguish character from character. Despite the fact that this is possibly her least popular in this trilogy of books, at least talked about, I do think it is perhaps her most daring, because the subject of this book is actually just the sexual lives of Satrapi's aunt and grandmother, you know, and their married lives. Not exactly what most people find appealing. And so the fact that it breaks through so many stereotypes about female sexuality I thought was really interesting and cool and admirable. It also obviously gives you not only the lives of just any middle-aged women, it's women who live on the other side of the world who have a completely different experience than any awkward conversations I might have with my own mother, grandmother, and aunts, which are not going to happen, trust me. I thought that this was a really rich narrative to really learn a lot about other women's experiences throughout. And that it really is a culmination, at least for now, of her nonfiction series and talking about her own life, and has convinced me that I will probably now always pick up any new Satrapi book that I can find, because I know I will be in for something at least marginally interesting. No, 4 or 5 stars, I forget. I think they were all rated 4 stars. This one might have been rated 5, because it was absolutely amazing. And the troll in me just could not stop squeeing over how shocking people would find it. Because I'm childish like that, right? And now I'm running out of battery too, so I'm just going to have to really I'm sorry this review was so random. I'm just glad it's over now, because I've been meaning to do it for forever. Haters gonna hate! And if you like this video, then I'm glad I could bring a little more confusion to your soul. And as always, I would like to acknowledge that for the most part, all of my videos are filmed and produced on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, an Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation, land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant.